So we welcome Ed Kimber to the show. Probably recognise his name. He's the 2010 winner of the Great British Bake Off, which was Series 1, wasn't it, Ed?
It was, yeah, the original series, yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Great show to be on. People are obsessed by that programme.
Yes, they definitely are.
So we're talking about baking and baking disasters, and I've got an issue that I'd like you to solve up for me. But,
Sure.
But you're talking about the fact that baking needs to be quite almost procedural in a way to get the recipe correct?
Yeah, what happened is there was some research commissioned by Foster Grant Reading Glasses, and they found that the majority of people are having some sort of disaster in the kitchen. Yeah. And your region actually has the highest amount of people misreading recipes. And with baking, that's quite important.
I think that's hilarious because, obviously, within Cambridgeshire,
yeah,
we have the highest academic, ability, and yet people can't read recipes.
Can't read recipes, yeah, definitely. And there's also a similar amount of people who are not following recipes; they're just making it up as they go along. And the problem with that in baking is it's not cooking where you can chuck a bit of this in, chuck a bit of that in. You do need to follow the recipe, and just making it up is never going to be a good recipe for a good cake.
You see, that is so true. I can't, because I like to experiment, all right, in the kitchen. And one thing that I need to ask you about is pastry. But are you right to talk to me about pastry?
Yeah, of course.
In a bit, we'll talk about that. That's the thing I need the help with. But but it is amazing because baking is actually quite scientific, isn't it, to get it right?
It is. I mean, one of the things Foster Grant found is that people don't even measure things accurately. And for baking, especially if you're doing things like baking powder or, something that's really crucial to how a cake's going to turn out, then you really need to be accurate. So if something says a teaspoon, it's not the teaspoon you use to make your tea, it's a level, accurate measure. And you need to get, the special set of measuring spoons for that. So, accuracy is very, very important.
I think it's really interesting because over the time, I did an interview on this a couple of weeks ago actually as well about the way that people's taste has changed. And some of that is in our DNA now. We want bigger flavours, the takeaway culture and everything,
definitely.
The MSG and everything. And I think sometimes that's the reason it goes wrong because people will see a recipe and it has, a tablespoon of salt in it or something. They're like, well, that won't be it. We need a dessert spoon or something.
Well, I think you're right to some degree. I mean, we have a woman who she proofreads my book, and she proofreads it from a recipe development point of view. And she used to work for Good Housekeeping, and it's quite an old-fashioned standpoint she has. So I would say something needs a teaspoon of salt, and she would go, oh, no, it's just a teaspoon. And I was like, a pinch. I'm like, no, it needs more than that. So I think tastes have changed. And I think a lot of things, we've realised that, baking is food. And, like cooking, you need to season. And so salt is crucial to making cakes taste as well as they can, definitely.
So really the advice here is, with Foster Grant, is that you need to read the recipe correctly, really. Put your glasses on, basically.
It's quite key, yeah. I mean, what I would always say is you need to read the recipe a couple of times just to make sure you are aware of what's actually going to happen in the recipe. You don't want to get caught midway through a recipe getting confused. So read the recipe through a couple of times, and then also get your measurements sorted at the start. So, don't be rushing to grab the baking powder and accidentally grab the baking soda midway through a recipe. Get everything measured out ahead of time, and that way when you are baking, you should be a little bit more successful.
That's great. And just before I ask you about my personal bit of advice that I need, that we are going to broadcast as well, by the way, so it's hugely embarrassing. Where can we send people to find out more about this?
If you want to find out if you're in the majority of people getting things wrong, then you can go to fostergrant.co.uk, and that will show you where you're going wrong and what the stats are.
Magnificent. Thank you for that. Right, so are you ready for this, Ed?
I am.
Have we still got a couple of minutes with you? Yeah?
I think so.
Right, so I got myself in a little bit of an embarrassing situation with John Torode. Do you know John?
I do, yeah.
Okay, right. So, judge of MasterChef, for anybody that doesn't know him. Now, we had him on the show a few weeks back with a friend of his who runs a vineyard.
Okay.
They basically brought in a load of wine. And we were wine tasting during the interview. Now, we were wine tasting to a fairly large extent.
That's not very safe for a radio.
No, it's not at all. It's a really, really bad idea. And I will
Was that live?
I will never do it again. All right, let's just say I'll never do it again. But I got myself in a bit of an issue because I'm obsessed with pheasant pie.
Okay.
I love making pheasant pies. Now, I've got the filling. I'm really happy with the filling, but I cannot do the pastry at all. It's horrendous. during the interview, I was bigging up my pheasant pie to John Turone, who said, well, mate, I'm at the Good Food Show later on in the year. I want you to turn up and I want you to bring me your pheasant pie. And he said, I'll try it and I'll give you my thoughts on it. Right? And I'm thinking, great. And I you know, when the hole just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you're just like, and I really was in it. And I'm like, this is going to be the best pie, John, you've ever tasted in your entire life. So to save embarrassment, can you help us out, me out, with a recipe for a pastry that's going to be impressive enough?
Well, I think with something like a pheasant pie, obviously you do want the filling to be the hero for me. The pastry in some ways is more the kind of just the thing that's keeping it in there.
Yeah.
So with a classic kind of short crust, which is probably what you're going to go for, it's generally half fat to flour. It's kind of the rule of making a very classic pastry. What you want to make sure you're doing, though, is with that style of pastry, you want something that's got a little bit of a flake to it. So when you're rubbing the butter into the flour, you want to make sure it's not fully combined. You want the little pieces of butter that are still in there, kind of around the size of a pea. Because that way, when you roll it out, those pieces of butter are going to kind of smear in the pastry. And when that bakes, that butter will evaporate and leave kind of little air pockets, making the pastry nice and flaky. And it'll just create a much nicer mouthfeel as you eat it.
Do you know what? That's flipping genius, that is. I didn't know that.
And if you've got hot hands, then do the same thing, but in a food processor.
What sort of fat should you use? Is there anything that's best?
I like the flavour of butter, so I always use butter. But if you want a really tender and flaky pastry, then something like a white margarine can work, or something like that. But personally, for me, I much prefer butter. I think the taste is better. So as long as you've got good technique, butter's always going to give good results.
Thank you so much for that.
No worries.
Really appreciate that. And Ed, what's happening for you at the moment? You've got another book coming, have you?
My second book came out in the back end of last year, and it's going to the States later this year, and hopefully start working on another book soon, yes.
Well, listen, thanks ever so much for joining us on the show, Ed. I really appreciate it. I know how busy you are, and it'd be great to get you back on the Food and Drink Show at some point.
No worries, that'd be great.
I'll let you know how I get on with John.
Thanks very much.
Take care.